Hello, this is Darrell Castle with today's Castle Report. This is Friday, the 22nd day of May in the year of our Lord 2026. President Trump just completed a three-day historic summit with Premier Xi in China. He is not the first president to visit China since President Nixon also made that trip in 1972 when China was a far different nation than today, as it was then in the throes of suffering through the Maoist revolution. This is the Friday before Memorial Day, when we pause to remember the fallen, and for most of us, the start of a three-day weekend, but for Joan and I, it's a different sort of anniversary to remember 49 years ago. On this date, May 22nd, 49 years ago, we saw each other for the first time because we were introduced on a blind date with mutual friends, so we met 49 years ago. On this date, we've been together ever since, but our actual anniversary will come in December. That will be 49 for us. This Memorial Day falls 81 years after the end of World War II, 77 years after the end of the Korean War, 51 years after the end of the Vietnam War. I guess the other wars, the Desert Wars, are still going on in one way or another. Since we are into a little nostalgia this week, and to prevent burying the lead, it was 54 years ago that Nixon made his historic trip to China. It was historic because China and the U.S., although friends in World War II, had been bitter enemies for 23 years at that time, or since the Maoist revolution started. The governing principle upon which the Chinese government had been based for all those years, now 77 years, has been that capitalism would eventually fail, communism would ultimately triumph around the world. The triumph would come by way of revolution, as it did in China, but with the aid of countries where the communist revolution had already occurred. That principle explains why the real enemy of the Western forces fighting in Korea and in Vietnam was China and Russia, not North Korea, not North Vietnam. Well, when Nixon arrived in China back in 1972, the communist revolution had been ongoing since 1949, or 23 years, but China had not fared very well under communism. It was a desperately poor agrarian society in which the people were making little or no progress. There was very little indoor plumbing, especially in rural areas, very little access to electricity. GDP per capita was barely at subsistence levels. Unlike today, China was technologically backward with a massive military and manpower, but unable to technically compete with the West. Trade with China was at a mere $95.9 million per year. Nixon sought to build a bridge across the hostility of that world. He famously declared it, quote, "the week that changed the world," end quote. President Clinton had a different approach to China because he apparently believed that massive technology transfers and resulting economic success would ease tensions and result in a more peaceful world. To that end, in 2000, he gave the Chinese PNTR, or permanent normal trade relations, with the United States, and supported Chinese membership in the WTO, or World Trade Organization, in 2001. Before Chinese entry into the WTO, the U.S. trade deficit was about $83 billion with China, but by 2015 it was $367 billion. Chinese imports into the U.S. also surged massively, with an estimated replacement of U.S. jobs at about 2.4 to 3.4 million jobs. Communities built in the U.S. around the manufacture of electronics, clothing, furniture, automobiles, and other products were devastated. They all became known as the Rust Belt. Nixon visited a weak agrarian society, but the new economic policies turned it into an economic and military superpower. Now President Trump has visited that country, which has been hostile to the United States for 77 years. Trump's approach to negotiating is to assume he has the strength in the relationship and to use it to his advantage. Tariffs, export controls, global alliances, military power, all used in an effort to help benefit U.S. farmers, manufacturers, energy workers, many others. I predict Trump's trip to China will prove similar to Nixon's in some ways. They both sought direct personal negotiating, producing tangible economic benefits to both sides. With protection from dangerous strategic competition, there is a knowledge, or at least an assumption, that President Clinton's belief that economic success alone would moderate strategic behavior did not work. Guardrails have to be installed and adhered to. Nixon engaged an impoverished third world China for the purpose of using it to counter the Soviets. Trump engaged a powerful superpower to prevent it from obtaining or maintaining dominance in key areas. He got a public commitment from Xi to stop supplying weapons to Iran and to not aid in Iranian nuclear efforts. I have some thoughts on Xi's statement about Iranian efforts to develop nuclear weapons. In my view, his statement meant nothing, or it was what in the law is referred to as a legal fiction. He said that Iran should not have nuclear weapons and Iran should reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Well, duh, as the kids would say. Of course, for the world's economies, the strait should be reopened. That's a no-brainer. Both sides know that nukes are not the real reason for the attack on Iran, not the real reason for the continuation of that war. Thomas Massey, congressman from Kentucky, just found out in his Republican primary what the real reason is. If the Israel lobby or the Friends of Israel want you out of Congress, then you are out of Congress. There aren't many surviving Republicans who are not totally sold out to the Israeli lobby. Rand Paul is an example. Thomas Massey was an example. So almost no Republicans. About the same number of Democrats, although some Democrats seem to survive without total subservience. If there are grounds for optimism coming out of this summit, they can be found in Xi's public speech, or at least that's how I see it. The English version of Xi's speech comes to me via George Friedman and his Geopolitical Futures newsletter. So quoting Mr. Xi, quote, "Honorable President Donald J. Trump, ladies and gentlemen, friends, looking back at the cause of China-U.S. relations, whether or not we could have mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, win-win cooperation, is the key to whether the relationship can advance steadily. The world today is changing and it's turbulent. China-U.S. relations concern the well-being of over 1.7 billion people of both countries and affect the interest of the over 8 billion people of the world. Both sides should rise up to this historic responsibility and steer the giant ship of China-U.S. relations toward steadily and in the right direction," end quote. To me, that statement says this is a multipolar world. That's what I want. This is a multipolar world. And if we are to progress together and for the good of the world's people, you must recognize that. If you are willing to do that, then 77 years of hostility can end, at least open hostility can end. President Trump probably had the speech examined by his Chinese people, and he probably pointed out the thousands of Chinese spies who occupy every university of note, every corporation of note, even hold political office here in America. Yes, folks, that's right. The mayor of Alameda, California, has confessed to being a Chinese agent. There are hardly any members of Congress or the Senate who haven't slept with at least one Chinese spy. Mr. Xi, let me ask you this. If the Chinese are so smart, so technically proficient, why do you have to steal your technology and your scientific advances from us? I'm just guessing here, folks, but I imagine all those things were discussed. In short, China needs the American market to save its economy. In recent years, economists have noted that Chinese domestic consumption has fallen off a cliff, but production is soaring. That means that China cannot absorb nearly enough of its own production, and it needs the American market to do that. America needs China and Russia to help it find a face-saving exit from its war against Iran. You both control Iran. You both control Iran, China and Russia, that is, and we will endeavor to control Mr. Netanyahu. To carry my point a little further, Z mentioned the Thucydides trap, in which the ancient Greek political thinker Thucydides pointed out that when a rising power collides with an old power, war is always the result. He said he hopes that can be avoided for China and the U.S. If that is the case, both sides want to avoid war, then talking is at least a first step and a necessary step. To that end, they have scheduled another summit for Washington, D.C. in September, I think. Finally, folks, it seems to me that China has everything to lose and nothing to gain by war with the United States. George Friedman pointed out to us the fact that he mentioned Thucydides, Z that is. He mentioned Thucydides, but he did not mention Lenin or Marx, and to me that's pretty significant. That could mean a turning away from 77 years of false assumptions about the two countries. Why are these two men meeting and negotiating right now? Well, I think necessity is the mother of invention, folks. And right now they need each other. At least that's the way I see it. Until next time, folks, this is Darrell Castle. Thanks for listening.